When I was growing up, back when the world was still in black and white, I used to love whenever these horror film anthologies would show up on TV. And it brings me to the word of the day, which is portmanteau. That's something that combines items or elements. And that's what these films do, and that's the topic for today's episode of the Kazdoy Closet. I'm Kazdoy. This is my closet full of all the stuff that I love. I'm going to talk about some of my favorite horror film anthologies, what characteristics they have, how you can find these, and I also have a very special guest showing up. Most of these horror anthology films have some sort of a framing device or an overall story, and it's sort of an excuse to tell stories about other characters in the film or just separate stories, sort of like reading an anthology of short stories. One thing I always liked about watching these when I was a kid was it was sort of like watching 4 or 5 stories in one film. And I also knew that if one story wasn't working out that well, another one was going to come up pretty soon anyways, and that one could be really great. So I think the main signpost or touchstone for these films is Dead of Night from 1945. And this is really the inspiration for a lot of filmmakers who went on to make other horror film anthologies. And the framing story for this one is this architect traveling to this farmhouse for a possible job. And when he gets there, there's a group of people, and he seems to know them all, maybe in a recurring dream. And that's the excuse to launch into each person's own personal story. And then that framing device returns periodically, then goes into another story, and then at the end, it kind of wraps up. And this is really mostly well known for its final story, which is definitely its strongest. Michael Redgrave is a ventriloquist, and his dummy starts to have sort of a life of its own. And we've seen that before, but I think this is, if not the original time it was done, one of the very first times this was done. And the ending of this is still very memorable, very creepy. Torture Garden from 1967 is one of these Amicus films. That was a studio that was trying to compete with Hammer Studios. Hammer, I think, was much more successful. I'm a big Hammer fan, and they made a lot of horror films and thrillers and some other films. And Amicus came along to sort of compete with them, and they did a couple of good things too, including this one, Torture Garden. And this has a framing story of a carnival, and there's a man named Dr. Diablo, played by Burgess Meredith, and he's really good in it. And if you want an extra show backstage for £5, you can get an extra show from him, and where he tells you your future. And there's a statue of a woman holding these giant sharp shears, and he says, "Look into the shears of fate, and you see your future." And a lot of these stories in these films are often warnings or morality lessons to tell you about what's going to happen to you if you don't do the right thing. The other people in the cast include Peter Cushing, who's always great, and Jack Palance, who plays really against type because he's like a book collector. He collects Edgar Allan Poe books. The director was Freddie Francis, who directed a lot of horror films, but I think he's most notable for his cinematography on films like Cape Fear, that was the remake, and The Elephant Man. And the writer was Robert Bloch, who was a very prolific writer, wrote a lot of short stories. He wrote the novel Psycho, on which the Hitchcock film was based. He wrote some original Star Trek episodes and other TV. And in this film, I also see some bits of Psycho show up, a couple of lines and a couple of events, because I'm pretty well versed in Psycho. And at one point, somebody is stabbed on the stairway, and then another point, a person has a kind of an odd hobby, and he says, "It's more than a hobby," which is straight out of Anthony Perkins' line in Psycho. Now, with a similar pedigree, we have Asylum. This is also from Amicus Studios. And this also was written by Robert Bloch. This time, it's about the framing device is about a young man who is a doctor, and he goes to this insane asylum for a job interview, and for some kind of odd reason, the person in charge of the hospital is now an inmate. So he has to interview 4 different inmates at the asylum and see if he can figure out which one used to be the director of the hospital, who is now insane. I thought I was going to guess the answer to that, but I didn't, so I was kind of surprised. The cast, another stellar cast: Peter Cushing, Charlotte Rampling, Herbert Lom is in it. The director was Roy Ward Baker, who did a lot of Hammer films like Quatermass in the Pit and Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which I talked about before, and then did a lot of television like the original Avengers series. My next selection comes from this rather big Vincent Price Scream Legends collection, but the film I want to talk about in here is Tales of Terror, and this is from the writer Richard Matheson, another very prolific writer. He wrote The Night Stalker, he wrote Duel, he wrote the novel I Am Legend, and some original Star Trek episodes and Twilight Zone episodes. And this is from 1962. The director was Roger Corman. I could do a whole episode on him, and I probably will at some point. And he had 15 days to shoot the film, and there's 3 stories in here. So he said, okay, so I have 5 days to shoot each story. These were all adapted from Edgar Allan Poe stories. The cast is a dream cast. It's Vincent Price, it's Basil Rathbone, and it's Peter Lorre. The same writer, Richard Matheson, shows up again in my next pick, Trilogy of Terror. And this was actually a TV movie from 1975, very popular TV movie, and pretty scary for TV in 1975. There's no framing device in this one, no overall narrative, but there's 3 stories, and they all star Karen Black, who's good in all of them. But the last story is easily the best and the most famous, and it's about a Zuni fetish doll that is attacking her. And usually with films like that, like with those Chucky films or films that are supposed to be scary that have dolls or puppets, I don't find them scary. I just think, well, that's just a puppet. But this one holds up pretty well, and it's got a lot of good scares and shocks in it. The director was Dan Curtis, who is best known as being the creator and prominent writer for the Dark Shadows TV series. In 1982, Creepshow was released, and this has got some real good horror credentials. Stephen King was the writer. We all know he is. George Romero was the director. He is, of course, from Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. He's a horror icon. And a really good cast with Hal Holbrook and Leslie Nielsen, E.G. Marshall, and even Stephen King has a part in it too. Now these are stories, there's 5 of them, and they're inspired by the old EC horror comics of the 50s, like Vault of Terror and Tales from the Crypt and Weird Tales. And those were the very controversial horror comics that kids loved to read, and that the adults wanted to ban because they were too graphic or for whatever reason, even though they're all usually morality tales. So I don't know what they were so upset about. There's also an animated sequences introducing each story, and it looks like a comic book, and then it turns into a real life story. A few years later, in 1987, Creepshow 2 was released. 3 more stories, the strongest one being one called The Raft. The writer, again, Stephen King, but it was basically stories that he wrote, and George Romero did the screenplay for this one. The director was Michael Gornick, who's really best known as a cinematographer for Creepshow, the first one, and Day of the Dead. And Tom Savini is one of the most well-known and respected makeup and special effects artists, and he did the effects for this one as well. 3 years later, 1990, you have Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, and some people think this is a unofficial Creepshow 3 because Stephen King and George Romero are involved in this. It's also sort of a spin-off from the series Tales from the Dark Side anthology series. One of the strongest things about this, I think, is the framing story which involves a woman who I guess is a witch, and she's holding a little boy imprisoned in her kitchen, and she's deciding how she's going to cook him. And the woman is played by Deborah Harry of Blondie fame, and the little boy is trying to postpone his death by reading stories, ghost stories and scary stories from this book. And each time he reads a story, that launches into one of the stories in this anthology. So this one's a lot of fun. And then finally, something totally different from 1964 is Kwaidan, and this is a Japanese film, and there's no framing device except there is a voiceover for each of the episodes. There's 4 different stories told, and they're 4 Japanese folk tales with supernatural themes and also mythological themes. Like one story kind of reminds me of the Orpheus myth. The director was Masaki Kobayashi, hope I'm saying that right. And he also painted these surreal backgrounds. The whole look of this is very unusual. He plays a lot with the lighting and the music and the sound. And it's very theatrical and quite unlike anything I've ever seen before. At 3 hours plus is a little bit too long for me, but still quite enjoyable and very unique cinematic experience. Now I'm going to briefly tell you what's on each one of these discs that I showed you, how you can watch these, but first, as promised at the beginning, a very special guest dropped by. And as promised, we have a special guest today. She has been waiting months to get a reservation to tour the Kazdoy Closet. So let's bring her in, our special guest, Lori. Come on in, Lori.
Ooh, hey.
And I have 3 questions for you, Lori.
Okay.
Number 1 is, was the tour of the Kazdoy Closet everything you hoped and dreamed of?
It was scintillating.
Excellent, thank you. Question number 2, do you enjoy horror films?
No.
All right, question number 3, do you like musicals?
OMG, I love them.
All right, Lori, well, thank you for stopping by, and maybe we'll see you some other time. Let's take a look briefly at what each of these discs has to offer. This one is Dead of Night, and you can rent this. You can rent all these, actually. But if you want to buy this one, and we're talking mainly Blu-rays, $18. This is on the Kino label. It includes a nice documentary called Remembering Dead of Night, and then it has a commentary as well by a film historian. Torture Garden, you can rent. This one costs about $20. It's on the Indicator label, which is a very nice label, and it's got all kinds of extras on the back, interviews with the director, with the cast and the crew, and this is a very good release also. Asylum, you can rent. You can buy this on Blu-ray, $19. This is on the Severin label. There's about 3 or 4 different features. They're fairly short about the writer, Robert Bloch, and about some of the cast and crew, interviews with them. Tales of Terror, well, this you can buy separately instead of in this box set that I have. And you can get the DVD for about $8. If you have the Epix streaming channel or service, you can find it there. And this is really nothing on here, just the film. Trilogy of Terror, you can see this right now on Amazon Prime. You can rent it. This Blu-ray is on Kino. It's about $16. It has several features, some on Karen Black and some on the writer, Richard Matheson. Creepshow is something you can rent, or this is a special edition one from Shout Factory, or called Scream Factory. So it has this very nice hard box, and it has the Blu-ray with a lot of different special features on it. And then it has this very nice book of about 30 pages or so, all about the film with photos and stuff. If you don't want the full special edition one, you can just get the DVD for about $15. Creepshow 2 is now showing on Amazon Prime. You can also rent it. This is the Indicator copy with all the special features on it, of course. And this one's about $17. You can just buy a regular Blu-ray of it for $10. Like I said before, it's nowhere near as good as the first Creepshow, but you know, if you're curious, check it out. Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. This one seems to be going up and down in price all the time. I don't know why it's so overpriced. This one was going now for about $30. I got it on sale for I think about $20 or so. You can also rent this one. And finally, Kwaidan is now showing on HBO, surprisingly. You can also see it on the Criterion channel, which I mentioned in a different episode. And this is the Criterion Collection edition, and a few special features about the director and Asian film expert talking about the film Kwai-Dan. One thing I want to mention that I forgot is all of these films use practical effects, mostly because of how old they are, but there's no computer-generated graphics. These things exist, at least in the reality of the studio. They're all made by hand, and you can touch them. And I think that really increases greatly the enjoyment of some of these things, especially when you see actors interacting with things that are actually in the room with them. Hope you like this episode. Feel free to leave a comment down here. Maybe some anthologies I forgot, or I'm sure I did. Feel free to leave a thumbs up. Don't leave a thumbs down. Subscribe would be great. Share this with your friends and neighbors. Otherwise, I want to thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.